Hey everybody, welcome back to Barrack Saga. It's finally time to have a crack at Chapter 11, and after a couple of main missions that have been extremely difficult, this main mission is actually a defense map, which is really easy by comparison. At the end of last map, Faye headed off to the east to do some soul searching, but she was nice enough to leave the stuff that she was carrying for us to use. And because I did that map at the end of a chapter, she is not actually going to be gone for very long. She is going to be back in time for this map. Although her actual utility is still questionable because she's still pretty fragile. Now, there's a fair amount of trading going on. And in particular, I want to point out Volo taking a Night Sword that he currently cannot use. This is because he is very nearly level 15, and he's going to get there in this map, so he will be able to use that shortly. And in addition, I took some items off some of my units that I'm not deploying very much anymore. Next, we go into the usual sequence of events, starting with the civilian requests, and then moving on to some other events. The first of these other events is Her Situation, which is Sylvis's little event that heralds the unlocking of her side quest after this map. We also see Faye's return as a Swordmaster, now packing the Asterisk skill, which as usual for Kaji games is pretty damn good, so I'm sure that will see use at some point. As far as mercenaries go, all we're doing is hiring Dean. And there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, Dean is a pretty good combatant and we're going to need him for this chapter. And secondly, because this is a defense map, it's pretty much just going to be for training our units, and Dean still needs to get a few more kills for his permanent recruitment, but I'll touch more on that later. Dean buys himself a vulnerary here, and then we are going to sell a couple of bags, including Faye's, now that we finally own it. So that's going to give us a little bit more money to tide us over. And after this, of course, because it's the start of another chapter, we are going to head into the Kingfisher Pavilion and do some food. So most of my main combat units are getting something here, but in a rare case, I'm actually giving Reese something. He's taking a Butter Scallops, which gives him a little bit of extra crit. The reason for this was a strategy idea that I actually had for the next map, and it didn't end up coming to fruition, but I'll talk more about that later. And just to be clear, I'm still unaware of future maps, but I do see the subsequent map frequently after I do my test runs these days, so I have some idea of what I need. The rest of the food that we give is largely minestrone, which is a special type of food that gives its eater +1 luck if they like it enough. And luck is a mechanic that I have pretty much not touched on at all, because it is almost entirely irrelevant in this run. None of my units are getting to get nearly enough of it for it to be relevant. So, as I mentioned before, the principal purpose of this map for me is to grind up my remaining units that need it, and that would be Enid, Ruby and Dean. And I'm sure that you are all sick of me saying, oh, Ruby is deployed on this map because she still needs to grind up her weapon ranks in order for her to promote. And to be honest, I'm kind of sick of it too, but fortunately this is the last video that I'm going to have to say it in, because in this video all three of those aforementioned units are going to achieve their goals, and we're going to permanently recruit Dean and promote the other two. Now, speaking of promoting Ruby, you will have noticed that I have not hired Clifford for this map, and that's because not only is this map extremely easy, he is also really expensive and I am still tight on money. Plus we got Alvina in chapter 10, and she, though not as durable as Clifford, is still pretty strong, especially with her personal fauchard, which is a brave weapon. And that's going to see a lot of use throughout this map. The last rank Ruby needs to hit her promotion is her spear rank, which is currently sitting on 19. So she's going to be focusing on her spear rank for the duration of these first couple of turns. But the main part of these first couple of turns that's important is actually getting Enid her final level up to get her magic to the required threshold. I can pretty freely do this because the start of the map doesn't have all that many threatening enemies, and so it's fairly relaxed to reset the game every time she gets that level and fails to gain magic. However, thankfully, finally, she managed to hit her magic level up, and she is now ready to go. I intended to have her use the liquid magic here on a subsequent turn, but I ended up completely forgetting to do that, so she's going to be sitting on full magic until the preps for the next map at the very least. The principal threats on the map at the start are the two ballistae that are pointed directly at us, and I'm going to be prioritizing taking out those guys as soon as possible. And then at the start of turn 2, another large enemy group shows up, a squad of wyvern riders who would be extremely scary if we had to fight them, but fortunately we don't. The leaders of this squad are Zephyrus, who's the general who we've been hearing about a lot in the story, and he's pretty scary, and he and his second in command, Arcturus, are actually completely invincible in this map thanks to a Thracia-style immortality flag that causes any lethal attacks against them to miss. Fortunately, the AI of this group is to pretty much sit there unless one of our units gets within their range. They're meant to act as a deterrent to getting too far west, rather than a kill squad. Their range does cover one of the ballisticians, but we are going to be able to get around that, because you have to end your turn fairly deep into their movement range to trigger them to attack you, and we have Kanto to get in and out without being forced to fight them. So, I've talked about Ruby and Enid. The last unit who needs to get kills here is of course Dean, and he's still very good at that. He only needs 2 more kills in order to hit his permanent recruitment, but I'm not certain whether the 4 that he got as a guest unit in 1M count, so I'm going to be getting him more kills than that just to make absolutely sure he's going to join us after this map. This is of course very easy because this map is very long, and Dean is excellent at killing things thanks to Desperation and Vengeful and the weapon selection that I've given him. He is also going to end up at his promotion level by the end of this map, which is also very nice because on promotion he's going to become even stronger than he was before. Promotion has been a quite rare thing in the course of this playthrough, but Dean getting there is no surprise given the amount of kills we're required to give him and how good he is at combat. So, I am trying to push towards the western edge of this map, even though it's a defend map, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, reinforcements are going to continue to appear for pretty much the next 18 turns or so, and it's better to get the drop on some of those rather than letting them come to us. This is particularly important because some of the reinforcements are lance users, and we really do not want to be facing a hit from those guys at their full movement distance. The other reason to push forward is because of a civilian request. Rodin, the hunter that we met way back in chapter 3, is out hunting again, and once again Ward has to find him hiding in the forest and talk to him in order to get him to leave the map and earn our reward there. So Ward needs to push forward, and so he needs to be defended by the rest of our army, and Laurentia is also going to help out because she can reveal Rodin where he is hiding. Notably, Ward does not have a horse currently equipped, and that means he has to make his way to Rodin using his infantry movement of 4, and that is going to end up taking quite a while. So the next squad of threatening enemies on this map is a group of crossbow users, and I always find crossbows particularly annoying to deal with because they attack at one range, and that means that my zero range units mostly don't have any enemy phase output against them, so they're pretty tricky to kill. Alvina is coming to the rescue though because she has some extra movement and can canto. The reason she has that is that she has a special horse called a Liga Corsa, and this has an extra 1 movement compared to the 7 move horses that are standard across most of the other breeds. Now, it is possible to buy some of these high move horse breeds at the stables. They are of course randomly generated, and they are also hideously expensive, so I don't think I would have been able to fit them into my budget anyway. But it is entirely possible that having Reese on an 8 move horse might have allowed us to save a turn or two in certain previous maps, but obviously it's a bit late to be thinking about that now, and I only just learned about this recently. Laurentia is heading in against the first of the Ballistae. She can safely do this because the Ballistician already took his action, and so as long as Laurentia moves before the Ballista would on the next turn, she is not going to be taking an attack, and she can just swoop inside its inner range and not be at risk at all. The crossbow dudes have mostly been handled at this point, but I'm bringing Reese and Enid forward because of their skills that give them an aura of increased hit around themselves, and that's going to give Volo a little bit more accuracy as he deals with the last one here. Unfortunately, this leads to Volo's Shamshir finally breaking, which is very sad because the Shamshir has been with us since the very beginning of Volo's unit lifespan, and he's done a whole lot of good work with it, so rest in peace, O mighty sword. Another unit worth noting on this map is Burrows. I deployed him here because this is a defensive map, which is going to give him the opportunity to use his defensive skills in service to our cause. We already saw the effect that he can have between Overwatch and Battlecry in his side quest earlier, but now we're going to see it in a real battle situation. He does need to come forward a fair way, which means that he is also going to have to go back when this turns into an escape map, but he is still going to be fairly valuable throughout this map. Laurentia has been waiting patiently, but now it's her time to move in on the enemy Ballistician, and she manages to get a critical hit here, which is extremely nice, because that means that she can then move up and do other things instead of taking a second turn to deal with the Ballistician. The Axe Guard near my main group is a fairly scary enemy. They're pretty tanky because of their shields, but this one also has a killer axe, and that means that he's also an offensive presence that I don't want to deal with. Ruby goes in to beat him up, and this is actually fairly safe because Ruby has the Axebane skill, so it's fairly unlikely for her to be hit, and so the chances of her being crit is even slimmer, but unfortunately he's still on pretty high health and none of my units can reliably finish him off. So I send in Alvina next because she hits twice and has the best chance of avoiding a counter from him, and she manages to kill him, but I had other units standing by to finish him off just in case he had double shield blocked. We follow this up by tidying up the last enemy. This ends up being what I believe is Dean's 60th and final kill in the run, but obviously he's going to be getting more because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a little paranoid about whether he's actually going to be permanently recruited based on the 4 kills in 1M, and Sherpa moves forward to heal up. He's taken a few big hits, and he needs to preserve his bulk because that's what he's best at, so yeah, there we go. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that I haven't been using Ward's full movement on several previous turns. He does need to get out there fairly urgently, but we do have 20 turns overall, and so he is staying back a bit. until I actually have Laurentia reveal Roden. She's in approximately the right area at this moment. And now we have reached the turn 5 save point, so all of the training requirements that I did in the first block are now locked in, which is great. So, with the map about a quarter done, the theme of the next block is going to be completing some of my secondary objectives. And the first of those is obviously getting to Roden, who has just appeared by walking within 3 spaces of Laurentia. Now that he's shown himself, I'm going to hurry up a little bit with Ward, because there are some enemies quite close, and they're actually going to end up interfering with Roden a bit in a way that makes him at risk of being attacked. Now, Dean is being terribly indecisive here about what weapon to pick, but he finally makes his choice, and I apologize for taking so long to make that choice, because it really should have been pretty obvious. Anyway, so Ward is now going to be moving his full movement every turn until he reaches Roden, and that's going to require us to push forward with everyone else as well, obviously, to make sure that he doesn't get mobbed and get killed, because Ward dying is obviously a game over. Now, Alvina is going to be heading north to deal with the other ballistician. In addition, she's heading off some of the enemies that were up there on her way. Again, her mobility is unique on my team thanks to her special force, and so she is the only real choice that I have for getting into and out of the Wyvern's range safely, while the ballista is still a few spaces deep into it. We really do not want to trigger those Wyverns, but we also need to deal with the ballista so that it doesn't start shooting at us. Now, at the back of the enemy group is a raised priest, and this guy actually appeared quite a while back, nearly at the start of the map. He is actually a key target in other playthroughs because he's holding on to an item that's used at the atelier, but unfortunately, because I've been so efficient at putting down enemies instead of leaving them with low HP, he hasn't seen fit to move forward in an attempt to heal them, and so he's far too far back for me to get to. So unfortunately, we're just going to have to leave him behind. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the crossbow guys has moved next to Roden, making him visible to the enemy, so we need to deal with that post-haste. But firstly, Alvina is going to head north and one round KO the ballistician. And this is a surprise to me because I had so much bad luck with her accuracy against this guy in my previous attempts to record this map. She would usually miss one or both of her hits, and it would take me several turns in order to finally chip him down. And that wasn't helped by the fact that the aforementioned raised priest would move forwards and use Dark Mend to erase a big chunk of the damage I did manage to inflict on him. But fortunately, the RNG finally decided to be kind to me on this run, and so like with Laurentia, Alvina is going to be free to head down and help out my main group immediately. Laurentia deals with the guy who's threatening Roden, and I expected her to miss at some point as well, because, you know, missing is kind of what happens a lot in this game. I have grown to kind of expect even 70s or 80s to not be all that reliable, but thankfully at this point the RNG was being quite nice to me, and so Roden doesn't end up being attacked, which is pretty good because Ward still needs another turn to reach him. So with the Ballistae out of the way, and as mentioned, Ward now being in range to walk up to Roden and talk to him, that's pretty much all of the side objectives completed. And so we're now moving from advancing towards the side objectives to pulling back slowly, and killing anything that gets too close in order to keep ourselves safe. But the advancing phase of the map is definitely over, and retreat is the name of the game from here on out. Although, before we finish talking about side objectives, you've probably noticed the glimmering search spot on the hill to the south of the map by now. and I did not deploy any units with the search skill, so I am not able to send anyone to pick it up. This is kind of unfortunate, I guess, but I needed all of my deployment slots for either training projects or strong units to help me actually clear the map, and also at this point I don't think there's anything likely to be really important in these search spots. Sherpa moves in to deal with the enemy 2-range archer, which is his job usually, and he uses the Brim Ranger for reliability, but unfortunately the Brim Ranger breaks on the first strike, and that means that that enemy is still alive. So we have to divert Laurentia up there to finish him off in order to make things easier for the future, and that means that the crossbow dude next to her is still alive, and we have to bring in Enid to finish him off. She no longer needs to gain experience, but she is still contributing because thanks to the Lady Sword, she does still have somewhat decent combat, particularly in terms of accuracy. Alvina comes down to help us out as well, and this is just one more spot where I am very glad that she managed to deal with the ballista in such short order. And she continues to demonstrate the sheer power of her weapon everywhere she goes. Now, let's talk about Reese for a little bit. He seems really bad at this point, largely because his stats are just really low, and I also don't use him for combat all that much, and there are several reasons for this. Firstly, I do try to keep him safe from combat because he's the main lord and he needs protecting, and he also doesn't have Gram really anymore because I'm holding on to that just in case I need its miracle charm effect at some point. And the other reason is, of course, that Reese is never deployable on the side maps so far, and that means that he is absent for a lot of the easiest maps in the game. The final factor is that I am prioritizing kills for other units, like Dean just took a kill that Reese could have had a go at, for instance. And Reese getting that kill would have given him a ton of experience because of how under-leveled he is compared to where the enemies are at this stage, but I chose to give it to Dean due to not being certain that he was going to be permanently recruited. And so that's just another thing that Reese misses out on. So we are gradually withdrawing, and one thing I would like to point out is that Volo is largely not using his deathmatch skill. This is because in a defensive map, there's generally no time limit on killing these enemies, and also there are a lot of my units compared to generally small squads of the enemies. So for Volo, it's usually more important to preserve his HP by not letting the enemy counter than it is to use deathmatch to kill him fast, and we'll see an example of this later on. Now, I just killed an enemy with a face, but fortunately he is a generic. There are two enemies in the mix who are not generic. I don't think either of them has appeared yet, but they are part of the second civilian request. Unfortunately, despite the fact that they're not generic, their portraits and titles are still generic, and so it's very difficult to identify them. The only reliable way I've found is to let them walk right up to you, because neither of them will attack your units even if they're right next to you. Instead, they just beeline towards the seize point. In order to complete the civilian request, both of them need to reach the seize point and move off it, and so it's always a little bit anxiety inducing, because if you guessed wrong, or if you misidentified them, and you let an actual enemy get to that point, that's a game over. So it's always just a little knot when one of them gets close to the end. Obviously that doesn't happen in this run, but it is pretty mean of Kaga to make that a thing that can even happen. The other trouble with these guys is that they enter the map fairly late, and in particular the second one doesn't show up until something like turn 17, so I'm not going to be able to get both of them to the escape point before I have to escape. So unfortunately that civilian request is yet another one that I'm going to have to leave unfulfilled. With the arrival of turn 10, the general boss of this map shows up all the way to the left, and he is fairly slow with only 3 movement, but what his AI does is he'll wander over into the middle of the map, and then he'll generally stop moving unless one of your units is within his range. Because of this, he's generally fairly easy to avoid, but the trouble comes because he overlaps a lot with the Lance Knight, who's going to appear in a couple of turns. And we really need to deal with the Lance Knight, because otherwise he's going to be really scary and do lots of damage every turn to us, which I can't really deal with. So we do have to kind of stay back a bit because of the Lance Knight's movement, and that means we are going to have a bit of a clash with this general boss in a couple of turns time. Now, something rare happens. I ended my turn with a bunch of my units still to act. That's because at this point there really wasn't much for them to do, so we just move on and save a bit of time instead of me moving them around randomly, as I often do. So a couple of enemies are trying to head south around the big hill, while the large block of my units is to the north of that hill. So I'm going to send a couple of units down there to try and head them off, starting with Volo. Realistically, it might be worth trying to pull your army back at this point closer to the escape point so that none of these enemies can get around you. But I still want to keep my units out there to deal with the Lance Knight, as I keep mentioning, so I can't do that. Instead, we're just going to send Volo and Laurentia down there, and they have the offense between them to deal with this guy eventually without dying. Dean is continuing to show off how good he is at combat, and he actually gets a defense level up here, which, while it's still only 4, is something, I guess, because Dean is mostly bulky due to his high HP, and his real asset is his attack. But still, a defense level, especially in this game, is nothing to turn my nose up at. Another crossbow dude comes along who's really annoying because he has killer arrows, and that's really scary because I do not want to get crit. So I send Alvina in to 1 round KO him, and instead what happens is that she misses 2 attacks, has to take the counter from him, and then she misses one of her 2 follow-up attacks. So that guy ends up still alive and still very threatening, so we'll have to try again next turn. Ruby is in full retreat at this point, but she is also actually going back to head off the enemies trying to loop around to the south. She's just heading straight for the choke point. As I mentioned earlier, the Raise Priest likes to heal units that you leave alive, and he does so here to give the Killer Arrow guy a new lease of life, which is kind of annoying, and it makes what happens with Alvina really annoying because I try again with her, and she once again misses one of her attacks, and that's really unhelpful. The RNG is not being friendly to me at this point, but as you can no doubt tell from the fact that you are watching this version and not any other, it is going to work out in the end. Besides, the RNG isn't being so unkind to me as to let me get crit, so that's at least something. Dean is going to use his war pick here. I don't know why I spent so much time looking at other options, because the enemy with a shield should really just be Dean uses the war pick on them by default, because anything else is just silly, but you know, I'm not the best at this game. Anyway, so 2 of my units are left within reach of the boss, so I'm not going to have the opportunity to get them both out of combat with him. So let's talk about him for a moment. He has a magical sword, which means that my shield blocking isn't going to be particularly useful at stopping his damage, and he is also ridiculously durable. Sherpa doesn't deal any damage to him at all because of how powerful he is and how much he uses that shield. So despite the fact that he is also holding on to a crafting ingredient, we're not going to make a go at it. because I didn't bring Clifford with his Iron Lance or any mages. The Axe Guard to the south keeps shielding against Volo and Laurentia's repeated attempts to kill him, so he's going to take a wee while to die. And then Burrows is sitting in the middle. I'm trying to keep him useful for as long as possible by using Battle Cry, but he does have really crappy movement, so he is going to have to start retreating soon, and when that happens, he's going to just have to hustle to the end and not going to be all that useful. The enemy Lance Knight has finally spawned, so we now have to be even more careful than before that I don't leave any of my units in a bad position. And meanwhile, the Axe Guard is moving in to target Volo in combat instead of heading for the seize point. And that's good because it means that Volo is able to keep trying to do damage to him, or at least do damage to his shield. The boss chooses to attack Sherpa here, and he has a surprisingly high hit rate, but he actually ends up missing, which is really good. And Sherpa proves what I was saying earlier by dealing 0 damage back, but you know, that's just how it is. And my units are now kind of out of the boss's reach because he has 3 movement and my lowest move unit with 2 movement is well away from him, and everyone else can just outrun him. So now the Axe Guard has moved onto the cliff in its attempts to murder Volo, and so I attack him using the Night Sword and kill him, or that is what would have happened if the Night Sword hadn't broken mid-combat. And really, I'm having a bit of a bad run of my weapons breaking mid-combat during this map. It's not particularly surprising given how many fairly worn out weapons I've been using, but it is kind of annoying, especially with the Night Sword here. So, the Lance Knight has a kind of irritating AI where it tries to move close enough so that next turn, if you don't move, it can charge in to do its full damage. And that's a big part of why its overlap with the enemy boss is so annoying. Really, the only realistic way to get the Lance Knight out of the way is to let it charge up and take a pot shot at you. But that's not particularly safe if the boss can also reach you, which means you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Laurentia decides to roll up and use the Killer Spear against the Axe Guard because apparently saving durability on Euthyphro is more important than actually killing the Axe Guard, which I guess is true because this is just a defense map, but I still feel like this wasn't a particularly good idea in retrospect. But either way, that guy's shield is now broken and Volo can now just finish him off. Unfortunately, I chose to attack with Laurentia instead of giving Volo a new weapon, so he gets attacked while he's unarmed and doesn't deal any damage on the counterattack, so he's forced to use his action to finish the job. And because we've taken so long to break through the Axe Guard's shield, there are now 3 more enemies moving in towards Volo and Laurentia, and the lead one is an Imperial Knight. Now, fortunately, this Imperial Knight is not going to be trying to attack Volo or Laurentia, because he's one of the 2 people who we're meant to let through, but it is a fairly scary looking formation nonetheless. Alvina now rolls in to take a very scary looking kill, because despite the fact that she easily gets the kill, she is now within reach of both the boss and the Lance Knight, which I literally just finished saying was a very bad situation to be in. But worry not, we are coming up to the turn 15 save point, and that makes it pretty easy to rig her survival, while also baiting in the Lance Knight so we can start dealing damage to him. The attack by the boss is just an unfortunate event there. So, more and more enemy cavalry units are going to start spawning from now, so my squishier units need to head for the escape point so that they're not in range. And in particular, Enid is very easily killed at this point, so she needs to hang back. Although, speaking of Enid, With the foreknowledge of having recorded this commentary sometime after recording the gameplay footage, I am now aware that Enid is about to become an absolutely monstrous glass cannon as soon as she gets her promotion event, so we have that to look forward to. For now though, she is just a scared little girl running for the hills and occasionally giving +5 hit to some people nearby. Alvina ends up surviving the first part of this turn pretty easily, although not by dodging as I expected, but actually by shield blocking. So even though she's not Clifford, she is still fairly durable. And then she is going to have a go at the Lance Knight with her Fauchard before retreating just a little bit. And this in theory allows her to move in and attack again next turn before retreating out of the boss's range. Although it doesn't actually end up working out quite like that, but we'll come to that. Meanwhile, Burrows is going to pull out his Scorpio and use Overwatch to cover her. This was intended to get the Lance Knight after he was chipped down further by Alvina if she failed to kill him, but also didn't work out quite as planned, and we'll get to that as well. And Laurentia is now moving in to help out up here a bit, but she fails horribly and breaks her shield and takes some damage, so yay. You may have noticed that a second Lance Knight just appeared on the map, but this one is so far back and so late that he is completely and utterly irrelevant, so it's fine. But you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot more cavalry reinforcements coming in now, and this has been a running theme in several defensive maps. When the cavalry enemies really start showing up, that is when you want to be heading for the exits of the map and escaping. So that is of course what we're going to do. We're going to just slowly pull back away from the concentrated cavalry enemies as much as possible. Laurentia makes use of her windsweep skill here to completely avoid a counter even if she had missed. I don't think I use windsweep very often, so it was very exciting for me to find an actual use for it. The Lance Knight, however, is a complete jerk and uses a vulnerary, and the boss moves in to fight Alvina again, which I hadn't anticipated at all somehow because I am not very smart. But in any case, we are going to have to find another way to finish off that Lance Knight. I am still quite focused on dealing with him though. So you may remember earlier when I mentioned about deathmatch having downsides in this kind of map. Well, here we go. Volo ends up taking a couple of hits from the enemies here, and that's not ideal, leaving him at very low health. And then he gets charged by another enemy, and he breaks his killing edge. So all in all, that was a pretty bad round for Volo, and he's now in pretty dire straits. Burrows does trigger his Overwatch here, so we do manage to avoid getting beaten up by one enemy. However, there are still other enemies who can make it through to attack my units, especially a bow enemy who can actually reach Burrows, but for some reason that guy chooses to charge in and try and kill Reese instead. And that's probably a good thing overall because Reese can shield and is much less vulnerable than Burrows is. And that guy is then going to be killed by Ward in a moment, and he ends up dropping some sniper arrows, which explains why it was so accurate against Reese, but because we get those sniper arrows, that's a pretty good trade, I think. I haven't been using Sylvis all that much recently because she is also quite expensive to hire, but we are about to permanently recruit her during this chapter, and I have definitely not forgotten her. She is still really quite good, and she is going to be used more in some later maps. So Ruby moves in to support Volo, but she's really not going to end up doing all that much to help him out, because he's on low health and he's going to get targeted by everything anyway, and there's no way that Ruby can kill everything that she needs to make him safe. So we're going to have to find another way to keep him alive. At this point, I was honestly fairly sure that this was just going to end up being another reset with Volo dying, so I chose to pull Dean away from the boss instead. Ward gets attacked by the Lance Knight, but he manages to dodge it, so good job, Ward. And then this is the end. Volo's gonna, oh wait, he dodges 252s, which is absolutely insane. So Volo is saved by complete chance, and we get to carry on. And Laurentia is going to swoop in and kill that crossbow guy, making sure that he has absolutely no way to kill Volo next turn, except that in killing him, there is now no way for her to block both spaces, and that means that the bow cavalry can now move in and shoot at Volo at his leisure. So that really wasn't a very good strategy. However, then I remembered something. It turns out that Ruby has been carrying around one of the escape stones. So Volo is able to grab that out of her inventory and use it to flee the map, surviving, thankfully, and making sure that this particular run was saved. We finally need to start killing off the Lance Knight, back from full health again, and both Ward and Alvina are going to have a crack at him, but they're not going to quite be enough because of the shield blocking, which is really annoying, but that's okay, we'll get to it eventually. Now, something to note is that I've only really been using Alvina for a single map so far, and her fauchage is already severely worn out. And that seems to be the pattern with the really strong pref weapons I find in this run. I see them and I'm like, yay, this is amazing. So I use them a bunch and then they break. And so that is pretty much what's going to happen with Alvina, but not for another couple of maps. Sherpa and Reese ignore the Lance Knight and instead head down to try and kill an archer, but this is where Reese really sucking kind of comes to the fore again, as he goes to finish the guy off and procs adept and manages to whiff both hits. I really wish he'd managed to get that kill. It probably would have done something useful for him, but such is RNG, and I wasn't going to risk rolling over the RNG that gave Volo his life. So Burrows is the one to finally kill the Lance Knight. With the new type bolt, he has just enough juice to finish the job and get another level up. So he is still finding ways to be useful even in this full retreat. So at this point we have now kind of dealt with the enemies trying to sneak in along the south of the hill, and all we have left to worry about is those coming in through the main path around the north. So the boss has finally been left behind. He's not going to be harassing us anymore, but we do now have to deal with the spear cavalry coming from that direction. And one of those guys runs up to Ward and is going to give him a pretty big whack. And Ward is a game over condition, so we really do not want him to be dying. Now, normally Ward isn't in all that much danger, but this is getting into the really late game, and his stats are no longer as dominant as they once were, and also I don't think he has a shield currently. And speaking of shields, Laurentia also doesn't have a shield equipped, even though I just changed her lance, so that wasn't very smart. And this is particularly bad because she runs up to this guy and attacks him, but he has counter, so she gets whacked for some pretty big damage. So all in all, I haven't made the greatest of decisions with some of my units during this map, and it's quite frankly a bit of a miracle that it all manages to work out in the end. But really at this point, it's clear that my defensive line is starting to crumble and that it is time to be heading for the hills. However, we cannot do that quite yet because the defend point is still a defend point, and we just have to wait out another couple of turns before we can finally do what we need to do there. So at the start of turn 19, the kill squad shows up. This is a raised priest with a large number of powerful mounted units alongside him, and being in range of these guys is basically instant death. But obviously they're so far away that it doesn't really matter. Burrows triggers Overwatch again, saving Ward from an attack, but unfortunately there are still Armor Knights, and one of them steps up to Ward and knocks him all the way down to 2 HP. So that's pretty bad, and there's still another Armor Knight that can move in to attack Ward, though fortunately with much lower accuracy, and Ward manages to dodge to stay alive. But this is a near-death experience for Ward. Hopefully it makes him rethink how he's been treating Christine, huh? Anyway, the thing about the Raised Priest is that he has Wormwood, which allows him to attack us from literally across the map, which is never fun. But thankfully Burrows manages to dodge, even though he is sitting in a largely immobile ballista. Fire Emblem logic, it makes sense. So at this point there's enough mounted units near us that we really just need to wall Burrows off in order to keep him alive. And we're going to have Ward sitting in that wall of bodies, and that's not ideal because Ward only has 2 HP left. But Ward is usually the one guarding, but in this case we have Sherpa guard Ward, just so that Sherpa and his massive bulk and full HP is the one taking the hits instead. But this is basically the last really challenging turn. All we need to do from here on is set up in such a way that at least some conceivable string of random numbers will allow us to escape with everyone, because we have the final save point coming up, and after that we are able to finally start escaping. At the start of turn 20, the defend point ceases to be a defend point and becomes an escape point instead. And this means that the goal of the map sort of changes. It's no longer necessary to keep enemies from reaching that point, because they can no longer seize it to give us a game over. It is exclusively for us to escape, and the enemies now focus on trying to murder us if they can. So the Great Wall of Sherpa is there to keep Ward and Burrows from being targeted by these scary mounted units. In the process, Sherpa ends up breaking his longsword, but that's not really a big deal. It just adds, I guess, to the graveyard of weapons that we're leaving in this valley. And then one of the enemies runs up next to me and doesn't attack. And I think it's funny, I'm not 100% sure, but I think Burrows might actually have hit this guy with Overwatch earlier, and since he's not attacking, he must be the second unit who we were meant to allow to escape. So it's amusing that I potentially screwed myself out of the reward for that civilian request by being a little overzealous with Overwatch, but really I don't care one way or another. I just wanted out of this map at this point. And out of this map is what we are, because all of the enemies that could possibly reach us have already made their move. So there is absolutely no risk in retreating in good order, and Reese does so to complete the chapter in 20 turns. See you later.